All right, Terrlyn. It's actually one of my favorite topics because influencers sometimes come in a second. Sometimes they come in a lifetime, different ways, positive, negative ways of being influenced. When I speak, I always talk about my grandfather, him, my grandmother, my mom, my aunt. They came from Kyiv, Ukraine, and they immigrated to Canada years ago. And when I was about five or so, my grandfather used to take me for walks in the park in Montreal. And one day I saw he spoke to everybody, which is obviously I got that DNA from him. But so one day I asked him, I said, Zeta, I called him, how do you know all these people? And he said, and I remember him pointing, he said, see that man over there? One day I smiled at him and he looked up and smiled at me. And he came over and then he became one of my best friends. We do this. And while we were doing that, somebody else came over too and saw us smiling and laughing. And as a 5-year-old, I'm thinking, life's pretty simple. I just got to smile at people. And then you get older and you start complicating things, but it's not really complicated. Just even a smile can be influential.
Mhm.
So there's probably many, but can you share two or three people that have been influential in your life?
Yeah, and actually I want to share people from my upbringing because I think that's really important. It's the essence of who I am. And so I'm going to share four, but two of them come as a pair, and that's my mother and father.
Sure.
My mom and dad were the greatest. That does not mean that I had a perfect life because I did not have a perfect life, but my parents taught me the value of caring about other people. And they also taught me about having a strong faith in God and being okay, like I said, to question things. So I don't just have this faith that's just a blind faith. It really is about being bold enough to ask God the difficult questions and being bold enough to talk about the parts of my faith that I say, I don't believe that part. I don't believe that what's written there is not an interpretation of man or human or whatever.
Love
And
that.
so my parents, though, were just really, really great. They modeled what it meant to take care of other people. So when I was 10th grade, my mother asked me, how did I feel about going to stay with an older couple in the neighborhood because the wife was sick? So my best friend and I, as 10th graders, went to stay with this older couple because the woman had had a stroke and her husband was taking care of her. So here I am going and spending the night there, taking care of them. And what teenager wants to do that? But
Nice.
that taught me a valuable lesson. But the second person then who influenced me was the husband of that woman because we would engage in these very deep conversations about the Bible. He'd ask me questions about Halloween. And then he asked me this question one day. He said, what do you think about homosexuality? Now, this is a man who had a fourth grade education,
Wow.
and he was probably in his late 80s when he asked me this question. And, at the time, I'm thinking, I said, well, I don't know. The Bible says it's wrong, so I guess it's wrong. And he said these words to me. Now, I want you to imagine this in the late 70s, early 80s in Mississippi. And he said, well, the Bible says, let man not lay with anything that's unnatural. And as far as I can tell, that's natural for them.
Wow.
Opened my mind up so much. And so his name was Mr. Mel, and it was very, very important to me to be able to ask him whatever questions I wanted. Third person,
That's
all of
that's
that.
amazing.
So the third person was my pastor. And I had a white pastor growing up in a predominantly Black church. The only white face was my pastor and his wife. This man taught me what it means to love and to share your faith and to be gentle, not always gentle, but he taught me how to be in that space of being the only one. So in 2017, I became the pastor of a predominantly white church, but I had him who had already modeled what that was like. I didn't know it as a kid, but
Yeah.
he'd already modeled it. And we loved him. I mean, my niece even had him to marry her. He drove from Mississippi to Texas to marry her years later. That's how much we loved him, influenced him. He was at my father's funeral when I did the eulogy. And, when he was complimenting me, I said, but I learned how to be a pastor from you. And so it is really important for us to just connect with who we are and where we came from. And so those are my influencers.
Amazing. Love it. I love it. Thank you for sharing that.
Welcome.